Right now, if you're born in a hospital, it feels completely normal. A bright room, monitors beeping, a doctor standing by, clean white sheets, the quiet hum of machines doing exactly what they're built to do. But for almost the entire span of human history, that idea wouldn't have made any sense at all. So who delivered every single baby, for tens of thousands of years, before hospitals existed? The answer isn't doctors. It's a role that existed long before doctors did. Midwifery traces back to the Paleolithic era, roughly 40,000 years ago. Birth happened in genuinely life-threatening conditions, with no medicine, no sterile tools, none of the safety nets we now take for granted. Picture it, firelight flickering against the walls of a shelter, the cold pressing in from outside, a small circle of women crouched close together in the dark, no way to call for help beyond the people already in the room. Women largely relied on themselves to get through labor, drawing on knowledge passed down through generations, some of it even shaped by simply watching how other mammals gave birth in the wild. For nearly all of that time, hospitals simply didn't exist. Birth happened at home, in the same space someone cooked and slept, attended by a midwife and a small circle of trusted assistants. Archaeological and textual evidence places midwives practicing in a documented capacity as far back as 1900 BCE. But being trusted with something this important also made midwives targets for suspicion, danger, and eventually, accusations that could get them killed. We'll get to that. First, how did this knowledge even survive for tens of thousands of years, passed down with no hospitals, no formal schools, nothing written down at all? For most of this history, midwifery lived entirely in oral tradition, taught through apprenticeship, most often passed directly from mother to daughter, generation folding into generation without a single page of instruction, a lineage carried entirely in memory and hands rather than ink. Then, in ancient Egypt, something changed. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest known medical texts in existence, contains direct references to birthing practices and the role of the midwife, giving historians one of the first written glimpses into a profession that had already existed, unrecorded, for tens of thousands of years. Once civilizations began writing things down, the details of what actually happened inside the birthing room become much clearer, pulled slowly out of centuries of silence, and considerably stranger than you might expect. Long before any medical test could confirm a pregnancy, ancient societies developed their own methods, some clever, some almost bizarre, tested and repeated by women searching for any sign, any clue their bodies could offer. Historical texts describe practices like examining the visible veins across a woman's breasts for changes, seating her over a mixture of beer and mashed dates and watching closely for vomiting, and even inserting an onion internally, then checking whether its scent could later be detected on her breath. It's worth being direct here, historians aren't certain how seriously these methods were actually trusted as medicine, versus functioning more as folk belief passed down alongside genuine knowledge. Fascinating, certainly. Reliable, far less clear. Detecting a pregnancy was one thing. Surviving the birth itself was an entirely different challenge, and in some parts of the ancient world, not everyone received the same level of care. In ancient Rome, the quality of care a woman received during childbirth depended heavily on one factor: money. Wealthier Roman families could afford professionally trained midwives, women skilled specifically in managing complications, positioned only steps away the moment anything went wrong, ready with tools and technique the moment labor turned difficult. Poorer families, without access to that same trained expertise, often had no midwife at all, relying instead on whichever female relatives happened to be present when labor began, doing their best with nothing but experience and instinct. Pregnancy itself was measured in lunar months, with a baby considered fully born in the 10th. And men, notably, were kept out of the room entirely, unless a physician was specifically required for a high-status mother facing serious complications. But one Roman-era physician's writings would go on to shape childbirth practices for generations. In the 2nd century CE, the physician Cyranus of Ephesus authored what stands as one of history's most comprehensive obstetric manuals, covering prenatal care, the stages of labor, and newborn health in remarkable detail, the kind of careful, page-by-page observation that suggests years spent at the bedside, watching, learning, refining. Among his documented contributions was a specific technique for turning a fetus during a complicated birth, a method detailed enough and effective enough to earn a lasting place in the history of obstetric care. On the other side of the world, an entirely different culture was treating childbirth not just as medicine, but as something sacred. In aristocratic households of Heian-era Japan, between 794 and 1185 CE, childbirth became a carefully staged, spiritually significant event. The birthing room itself was deliberately positioned in the north of the house, and dressed entirely in white, from floor to fabric, every surface chosen with intention, nothing left to chance. Trusted midwives attended the mother, while prayers were recited throughout labor, soft voices carrying through the white-draped room, seeking protection for both mother and child through a moment considered as spiritually charged as it was physically dangerous. For all of this care, all of this ritual and respect surrounding birth, one dangerous era was approaching, an era where simply being a midwife could put your own life at risk. During the medieval and early modern periods, the very knowledge that made midwives so essential also made them targets. Women skilled in herbal remedies and birth complications increasingly fell under religious and political suspicion, their gentle, hands-on expertise suddenly reframed as something to fear rather than trust. Some midwives, specifically because of their healing knowledge, were swept into accusations of witchcraft and heresy during the witch trials of the period, their expertise reframed almost overnight as something sinister rather than something needed. A woman who once delivered your children now standing accused in front of a tribunal for the exact same knowledge that once made her indispensable. And yet, even during this dangerous era, midwives were often quietly outperforming the very physicians who were beginning to replace them. When male physicians started attending births more regularly in the 1700s and 1800s, it wasn't automatically the improvement it appeared to be. Before the discovery of germ theory and the widespread adoption of antiseptics, physicians frequently moved from patient to patient without washing their hands in between, carrying invisible danger from one bedside straight to the next without ever realizing it, unknowingly spreading infection from one birth to the next. Midwives, by contrast, often produced better outcomes during this same period, largely because they weren't carrying that same infection risk from patient to patient. So if midwives were often the safer choice, what actually convinced the world to move birth into hospitals at all? The shift, when it finally came, happened astonishingly fast. In 1933, only 35% of all births in the United States took place in a hospital. By 1955, just over 2 decades later, that number had climbed to 95%, a complete reversal within a single generation. An entire tradition of home birth quietly emptied out and replaced almost overnight. But this rapid shift wasn't only about safety. Early hospital birth often came at a real cost to a woman's autonomy. Women frequently kept in a fixed supine position throughout labor, sometimes physically restrained at the hands and feet, and routinely barred from having any family or friends present in the room, alone in a way no birthing room in the previous 40,000 years had ever truly been. A small but telling marker of just how recent this entire shift really is, Jimmy Carter, born in 1924, was the first sitting U.S. president in history to have been born inside a hospital. For 39,960 of the last 40,000 years, birth belonged to women helping women. Hospitals have only been part of that story for the last blink of an eye. Long before there were hospitals, monitors, or medicine as we know it, there was simply one woman helping another through the hardest and most human moment there is, and for nearly all of history, that was enough. When you picture ancient humans hiding from rain, you probably imagine a cave. Dark stone walls. A fire flickering at the entrance. Rain hammering down just outside the opening. There's just one problem. Most ancient humans probably never lived in one. Compared with the millions of people who lived during the Paleolithic, the number of caves we know they actually used is surprisingly small. Caves were rare, unevenly scattered across the landscape, and often already claimed by something far more dangerous than rain. So when the sky opened and it poured for days on end, where did most people actually go? Think about what was really at stake. A soaked animal hide stopped insulating the moment it got wet, turning from protection into a cold, clinging weight. A fire, once drenched, meant no heat through a freezing night, no way to cook meat before it spoiled, and in the wrong conditions, no way to survive until morning. Shelter wasn't just about staying dry. It had to fight off wind, hold back water, and protect the one thing that made survival possible at all, fire. And the first real solution to this problem is older than our own species. At a site called Terra Amata, on the coast of southern France, archaeologists uncovered evidence that many researchers interpret as the remains of temporary wooden huts dating to roughly 380,000 BCE, arranged in an oval shape, with what appears to be a central hearth positioned inside. This predates Homo sapiens entirely. Whoever built these structures wasn't Homo sapiens, not yet, but they were already solving the same problem humans still solve today every time we build a house. but not every archaeologist agrees on what this site actually proves. So how do scientists tell the difference between the remains of a real ancient hut and just a natural pile of rocks and debris that happens to look like one? This is where the work becomes genuinely forensic. At Terra Amata, researchers have pointed to patterns of post holes, small gaps in the ancient soil suggesting upright wooden poles once stood there, along with arrangements of stones that could have anchored a structure's base, and a hearth position that seems deliberately sheltered from prevailing wind. But critics have raised real, serious questions, whether some of these patterns could be explained by natural sediment shifting, root disturbance, or coincidental stone placement over hundreds of thousands of years, rather than intentional construction. This is honest science, not certainty pretending to be fact. Archaeologists reading 380,000-year-old ground have to weigh probability against ambiguity, and reasonable experts can land in different places. What isn't in dispute is that somewhere, at some point, early hominins figured out how to build a roof from nothing but wood and instinct. One cave floor, though, holds a clue that's much harder to argue with. In another excavated cave, researchers found post holes arranged in a very specific pattern, not around the cave's edge, but positioned beneath a section of ceiling known to drip. Whoever lived there wasn't just sheltering inside natural stone. They built an additional, smaller roofed enclosure inside the cave itself, engineering a second layer of protection specifically to stop water falling directly onto them from above. A cave, it turns out, wasn't automatically dry. Sometimes it needed its own roof, built by the people living inside it. If people were being this deliberate about staying dry even inside a cave, what did they build when there was no cave available at all? Across open plains and treeless stretches of Ice Age landscape, humans became architects out of pure necessity, using whatever the terrain actually offered instead of what they wished it offered. Where natural rock overhangs existed, people modified them directly, draping stretched animal hides across the open face to block wind-driven rain, then building internal wooden pole frameworks inside, structured around a central hearth, essentially constructing a tent within a cliffside. In summer months on more open plains, some groups built semi-underground dome huts, partially dug into the earth itself, using the ground's natural insulation to soften both cold nights and driving rain at once. But what happened somewhere so barren, so far beyond any tree line, that there wasn't even enough wood left to build a simple frame? Picture the landscape first. Wide open, flat, and almost completely treeless, stretching toward the horizon in every direction across ancient Siberia. No forest nearby. No timber to cut, no branches to bend into a frame. If shelter required wood, this place should have been unlivable. So how do you build a roof, with zero building material anywhere in sight? Their solution was unbelievable. In Siberia, archaeologists have uncovered structures built almost entirely from the skeletal remains of mammoths. Massive curved tusks were arranged and interlocked to support the roof. Skulls and long, heavy thigh bones, stacked deliberately to construct solid outer walls. Archaeologists believe these structures were likely covered with stretched animal hides to help keep out wind and rain. These weren't temporary lean-tos. They were genuine architecture, built from the only large-scale raw material this landscape had ever offered, the remains of the animals that once walked across it. These structures kept individual families dry through brutal seasons. But what did it actually take to keep a shelter like this working, generation after generation, for far longer than any single family's lifetime? In one excavated cave, researchers found something remarkable buried directly in the floor itself, a deep, thick buildup of ash and charcoal. Evidence suggests the same hearth location was used, abandoned, and returned to repeatedly over roughly 1,000 years of occupation. This wasn't one family's fire. It was closer to an inheritance, a location passed down, rediscovered, and relit by people who may never have known the names of whoever first lit a flame there centuries earlier. All of this, huts, hides, bones, hearths, was still improvised, built directly from whatever raw material a specific landscape happened to offer. So when did humans actually arrive at the idea of a roof, on purpose, as a deliberate design, rather than a clever workaround? Centuries later, a Roman writer named Vitruvius tried to answer exactly that question, in his work De Architectura. It's important to be clear about what this actually is. Not an archaeological record, but a Roman-era origin story, Vitruvius's own attempt to explain, from a much later vantage point, how the very concept of roofing might have first developed. He described early shelters failing repeatedly against rain, water pooling, seeping through, and collapsing flat coverings, until people gradually learned to build roofs with a deliberate slope, smeared with clay, specifically designed to draw water away from the structure entirely, rather than simply trying to block it outright. A Roman architect, writing thousands of years after the fact, was describing the exact same core problem Ice Age humans had already solved with mammoth bone and stretched hide, just arriving at it through an entirely different material, in an entirely different era. Look at the full shape of this story now, laid out end to end. Different continents. Different climates. Different materials. The same solution. Wooden huts at Terra Amata, dated to roughly 380,000 BCE. Ice Age hide-covered tents built inside modified rock overhangs. Semi-underground domes on open summer plains. An entire house constructed from mammoth bone on a treeless Siberian steppe. A hearth kept alive across 1,000 years inside a single cave. And centuries later, a Roman writer independently arriving at the same core insight, that water needs somewhere to go, not just something to stop it. Your concrete roof, a Roman tile roof, a mammoth bone shelter, and a wooden hut built 380,000 years ago were all trying to solve exactly the same problem. Every roof since has really just been a refinement of the same idea: keep the water moving, and keep it away from the fire. Long before there were walls, doors, or even words for home, our ancestors were already doing the one thing every roof has done since: standing between us and the storm. Tomorrow morning, millions of alarm clocks will ring. Offices will open. Factories will start. Emails will arrive. By the time the average person retires, they will have spent roughly 90,000 hours working a job. 90,000 hours of alarms, shifts, deadlines, and someone else deciding what your day looks like. And yet, for 99% of human history, that entire concept simply didn't exist. No employer. No wages. No job title. For nearly 300,000 years, Homo sapiens lived without a single one of these things. So if nobody had a job, what did people actually do with their days? Survival still demanded work, every single day, without exception. Food had to be found. Shelter had to be maintained. Children had to be protected. But none of it ran through contracts, wages, or a boss handing out assignments. So how exactly did ancient humans decide who did what, without any of the systems we now assume are necessary just to organize a group of people? The answer doesn't start with Homo sapiens at all. It starts almost 2 million years ago, with a decision made by our ancestors that would quietly shape how humans organize labor for the rest of our existence. Researchers studying early hominins have proposed that around 2 million years ago, something shifted in what our ancestors chose to eat. Instead of simply grabbing whatever was easiest, some began focusing on high-reward but genuinely difficult food sources, underground tubers that required real effort to dig up, and eventually, large game that demanded coordination, patience, and risk just to bring down. The moment food stopped being simply available and started requiring skill, strategy, and effort, something else became necessary too. Different people, doing different things. But how do you actually prove people were splitting tasks like this almost 2 million years ago, when there's no written record, no drawings, nothing that directly describes a single day in their lives? The proof, it turns out, is written directly into bone. In 2025, researcher Judith Beyer at the University of Tübingen examined a striking pattern across Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens skulls, dated between 80,000 and 20,000 years ago. Male skulls showed a noticeably higher rate of head injuries than female skulls. The likely explanation points towards something dangerous: high-risk activities like large-game hunting, where a single miscalculated charge from a wounded animal could end in a skull fracture instead of a meal. It's important to be precise here. This is a documented skeletal pattern, interpreted by researchers as likely evidence of dangerous role specialization, not a definitive record of exactly who did what, every single day, across every culture. But the pattern is striking enough that it points towards something real. Some people were consistently doing far riskier work than others. If injury patterns reveal who was doing the dangerous work, what do they reveal about everyone who wasn't out hunting? This is where the popular image of prehistoric life starts to crack. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies do describe something close to a universal pattern, a sexual division of labor, where physical differences often shaped who did what, men frequently taking on hunting, women more often specializing in gathering, food preparation, and child-rearing. But often is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because this pattern wasn't a fixed law of nature. Among some Aboriginal groups in Australia, both men and women hunted, just different prey entirely, targeting animals suited to different skills, different terrain, different strategies. The rigid image so many people carry in their heads, man the hunter, woman the gatherer, as some kind of universal rule, simply doesn't hold up once you look closely enough at the full anthropological record. And it wasn't only adults contributing. If even the youngest and oldest members of a tribe had defined roles too, does that mean, in some sense, literally everyone had a job, just not the kind we'd recognize today? According to anthropological accounts, the elderly, no longer strong or fast enough for distant hunting or foraging, shifted toward more sedentary, skill-based contributions, tasks like tool-making, teaching, or processing food closer to camp. Children, meanwhile, were gradually introduced to simple gathering tasks early on, learning the skills they'd rely on for the rest of their lives, not through formal instruction, but by simply being present, watching, and doing. And here's the detail that makes this entire system genuinely remarkable. There's no evidence of a leisure class. No group sitting back while everyone else worked. Early human groups appear to have been fundamentally egalitarian, not necessarily by ideal, but by sheer necessity. Survival required close to universal participation. Everyone contributed, according to what their body could actually do. So if there was no boss, no leisure class, and no one exempt from contributing, how many hours a week did this jobless life actually demand? This is where the story gets genuinely contested, because one famous claim has shaped public imagination for decades, and it turns out to be far shakier than most people realize. Anthropologist Marshall Sahlins popularized the idea that hunter-gatherers worked astonishingly little, somewhere around 15 to 20 hours a week, spending the rest of their time in leisure, an idea that essentially painted prehistoric life as a kind of relaxed paradise compared to modern work culture. But researchers Kristen Hawkes and James O'Connell, examining this claim more closely in 1981, found a massive inconsistency hiding underneath it. Studies of the Paraguayan ache showed a work week approaching 70 hours. Meanwhile, the low-hour estimate often cited for groups like the Jews/Hoansi conveniently excluded huge categories of essential labor, tool-making, water-carrying, childcare, processing food back at camp. Once all of that labor gets properly counted, the actual Jews/Hoansi work week climbs to well over 40 hours. This should be treated exactly as it stands, a genuinely disputed academic debate, not a settled number carved in stone. The romantic idea of a 15-hour prehistoric work week makes for a great headline. The actual research tells a far messier, far more human story. Whichever number sits closer to the truth, something eventually broke this entire rhythm completely, and it wasn't a boss, a war, or a sudden invention. It was a plant. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans followed food. Now, for the first time, food would decide where humans stayed. Beginning roughly 11 to 12,000 years ago, human groups across multiple regions of the world independently began shifting away from nomadic hunting and gathering, towards something radically different, staying in one place, and growing food deliberately, on purpose, season after season. Agriculture handed humans something they had never reliably had before, surplus, more food than a single day, or a single family, actually needed to survive. But that surplus came at a real cost. Unlike mobile hunter-gatherer groups, who could simply move when resources ran low or danger appeared, farming communities were now fixed in place, tied permanently to their fields, and suddenly vulnerable to entirely new threats, raiders who knew exactly where to find them, and catastrophic crop failures that could threaten an entire settlement at once. Surplus food meant not everyone needed to spend their entire day producing food anymore. Which raises an enormous question. Who were the very first people in human history to do something other than hunt, gather, or farm? This is the moment the job, in something close to the modern sense, actually begins. Farming surplus meant a portion of the population could now be fed by other people's labor, freeing them to specialize entirely in something else. Religious figures, dedicating their time to ritual and belief instead of food production. Political leaders, organizing and governing communities that had grown too large to run informally. Craftspeople, pouring their days into pottery, tools, and construction, work made possible only because someone else was now growing their food for them. The very first job in human history wasn't chosen out of passion, curiosity, or personal ambition. It was made possible by a food surplus that would have been unimaginable to any human living just a few thousand years earlier. Now step back and look at the full shape of the story at once. Nearly 2 million years of early task sharing, shaped by high-risk, high-reward food sources. 300,000 years of Homo sapiens living entirely without formal employment, wages, or bosses, labor distributed instead by age, ability, and necessity. And then, a sudden shift, barely 11,000 years ago, a blink in evolutionary time, that introduced surplus, specialization, and eventually, something entirely new, work as a fixed identity, a title, a role you carry with you every single day, whether or not you're actually doing it in that moment. If jobs are really only the most recent chapter in a story this old, what does that say about the story we keep telling ourselves about what work is supposed to feel like? The next time you wake up to an alarm for work, remember this: for almost all of human history, nobody asked, "What's my job?" They only asked, "What needs to be done today?" We didn't invent work. We only recently invented the job. Imagine waking up disoriented, hearing voices no one else could hear, the walls of your world suddenly unfamiliar, the people around you speaking in a language you can no longer trust. And your community's answer was to drill a hole in your skull. It sounds impossible to survive. And yet, a striking number of ancient skulls, pulled from burial sites around the world, show exactly that. Bone that healed, smooth and rounded at the edges, evidence of a body that lived on for years after the procedure. So what were they actually trying to do? This wasn't random. It wasn't panic, or punishment, or an accident of violence. It was based on a very specific belief about what was happening inside the mind. Long before psychiatry existed as a science, every society on Earth still had to face the same reality. Some people suffered in ways no one around them could see or explain, their pain invisible, their behavior unpredictable, leaving families and communities searching for any explanation that made sense of what they were witnessing. And across thousands of years, the answers humans reached for swung constantly between two poles, the supernatural and the medical, often existing side by side rather than one replacing the other. The very first explanation humans reached for wasn't medical at all. It was spiritual. Trepanation, the act of cutting or drilling an opening directly into the skull, dates back to roughly 6,500 BCE. And remarkably, this wasn't confined to one culture, one region, or one moment in history. It developed independently across Europe, the Americas, Africa, and the Pacific, communities with no contact with one another, somehow arriving at a strikingly similar practice. Historians' leading interpretation of this pattern is that these communities believed a hole in the skull could let something trapped and harmful escape from inside the head, though the exact motive behind any single culture's practice can't be confirmed with certainty. Picture the tools alone. Sharpened flint in one region, pressed carefully against bone by hands that had done this before. Volcanic obsidian in another, its edge honed sharp enough to cut without shattering. In some coastal communities, even a shaped seashell, later replaced by bronze as metalworking spread. Different materials, different continents, yet a strikingly similar idea appearing across cultures, generation after generation. And in some cultures, the small disc of bone removed during the procedure wasn't discarded. It was kept, worn, and treated as a protective charm, reflecting the beliefs surrounding the procedure. This belief in something invasive, something living inside a suffering mind, didn't fade quickly. It shaped how entire civilizations understood mental distress, including one of history's most advanced early societies. In ancient Egypt, mental illness was largely understood through a spiritual lens, attributed to the anger of the gods or the influence of demonic forces. Treatment followed that same logic: ritual, prayer, appeals to divine mercy, incense drifting through temple chambers as priests sought to restore balance between a suffering mind and the forces believed to be pressing down on it. But alongside this spiritual framework, Egyptian practice included something genuinely striking for its era. Physicians recommended recreational activity as a way to ease psychological symptoms, music, movement, pleasant surroundings, offered specifically as relief. It wasn't a rejection of the supernatural explanation. It sat right beside it, a strikingly humane detail tucked inside a worldview still rooted in gods and spirits. In Greece, someone would come along and challenge that spiritual explanation entirely, and in doing so, accidentally invent one of history's strangest medical theories. Hippocrates offered something the world hadn't fully articulated before, a theory of mental illness with no gods, no spirits, no possession involved at all. In his framework, the body operated through a balance of four fluids, or humors, and mental illness emerged when that balance broke down, a physical imbalance rather than a spiritual punishment, something to be corrected through observation and care rather than appeased through ritual. His treatments followed accordingly, shifts in diet, rest, changes meant to restore the body's internal equilibrium rather than appease an angry deity. But Hippocrates' science carried its own strange blind spots. He believed that in women, the womb itself could physically move through the body, wandering, and that this movement could directly cause psychological symptoms, a theory that gave rise to the word hysteria, derived from the Greek word for womb. Hippocrates had rejected the language of gods and spirits entirely. And yet, he remained a firm believer in trepanation, the exact same skull-drilling procedure practiced thousands of years before him. So had anything really changed, or had the explanation simply been dressed in new language? Centuries later, a genuinely revolutionary shift happened, not in Europe, but across the Islamic world. Beginning in the 8th century, dedicated institutions called Bimaristans began appearing across major cities, the earliest founded in Damascus in 706 CE. These weren't holding cells or houses of punishment. They were hospitals, purpose-built, and funded through state and charitable support specifically so that treatment remained free, regardless of a patient's wealth or social standing. Picture a calm ward inside one of these institutions. Natural light pouring through open windows onto quiet, unhurried rooms. Fresh air moving freely through the space. The sound of running water, deliberately built into the architecture, its steady rhythm meant to settle a restless mind rather than simply decorate a courtyard. Music was played gently in the background, not as decoration, but as a genuine therapeutic tool, used intentionally to soothe patients experiencing psychological distress. And among those working within these institutions were some of history's earliest documented female physicians, treating patients as part of a system built around comfort, dignity, and care. While one part of the world was constructing hospitals designed around comfort and healing, another part of the world was about to move in the exact opposite direction. In medieval Europe, mental illness was reframed once again, no longer physical imbalance, no longer something to house and treat gently, but evidence of sin, demonic possession, or witchcraft. By the 13th century, individuals experiencing mental illness, disproportionately women, faced genuine persecution, swept into suspicion and accusation simply for behavior their communities couldn't explain any other way, whispered about by neighbors, dragged before tribunals for symptoms no one around them had the language to understand. Two physicians, Johann Weyer and Reginald Scott, writing in the 16th century, argued forcefully against this trend, insisting that many of the people being labeled and punished as witches were, in reality, individuals suffering from mental illness who needed help, not condemnation. Their argument was, for its time, a genuine act of compassion grounded in observation, a direct challenge to the fear and certainty driving the trials around them. Their writings were condemned and suppressed by religious authorities. Even when someone tried to bring compassion back into the picture, the system built to help people was about to take an even darker turn. By the 17th century, asylums had spread widely across Europe. But their true function often had little to do with healing at all. Many operated as much to remove people from public view as to actually treat them, warehousing rather than caring, rooms crowded far beyond what any single space could reasonably hold. Conditions inside were frequently documented as overcrowded and unsanitary. And treatment, where it existed, leaned on methods like bloodletting, a practice rooted directly in the same ancient Greek humoral theory Hippocrates had once championed, alongside restraint-based approaches like forced ice water baths, methods aimed at controlling behavior rather than understanding its cause. Two civilizations, living through the very same centuries, had arrived at almost opposite answers to the exact same question. One built calm wards filled with music and running water, treating suffering as something to be gently understood. The other built locked rooms and overcrowded wards meant to keep suffering out of sight, treating it as something to be hidden away. What does that split actually reveal about how we still approach mental illness today? Look at the full shape of this history now, laid out side by side. Trepanation, widely interpreted as an attempt to release something believed to be trapped inside the skull. Hippocrates, rejecting spirits entirely, while still drilling into bone and blaming a wandering womb. The Bimaristans, offering light, water, music, and dignity, centuries ahead of their time. European asylums, built in the very same era, offering confinement instead of care. This was never a steady march of progress, one era slowly correcting the mistakes of the one before it. Instead, history cycled again and again between compassion and punishment, science and superstition. Every era believed it had finally understood the mind. And every era was, in some real sense, still guessing out a hole in the skull. A wandering womb. A room filled with music and running water. A locked door. Every one of these was someone's honest attempt to answer the same question we're still asking today. How do you help a mind that's struggling, when you can't see what's wrong? Look around at the range of human skin tones on this planet, every shade from the deepest brown to the palest ivory, scattered across every continent, every city street, every crowded market, every family photograph. And then consider this, every single person alive today ultimately descends from early human ancestors in Africa who had dark, melanin-rich skin. So what happened? It's a question people rarely stop to actually ask, because skin color feels so permanent, so obviously tied to where someone's family comes from, that it's easy to forget it was ever anything other than what it is right now. But rewind far enough, past every migration, every border, every culture we now associate with a particular look, and the story collapses down to one single starting point, one shared ancestor, one shared shade of skin. The answer isn't really about color at all. It's about something happening invisibly, underneath the skin, a quiet biological negotiation that's been running for millions of years, long before anyone had a word for any of it. Deep inside your skin sits a pigment called melanin, and for most of us, we barely think about it beyond a sunburn or a suntan. But melanin isn't decoration. It's a survival tool, doing two competing jobs at the exact same time, a constant balancing act happening quietly in every cell, every single day. It acts as a natural sunscreen, shielding essential molecules like folate and DNA from the damage of ultraviolet radiation, while still letting through just enough UV light to trigger the body's production of vitamin D. Too much protection, and the body can't make enough vitamin D, too little, and folate and DNA start breaking down. Melanin's entire job is holding that balance, tuned precisely to whatever amount of sunlight a body happens to be living under, near the equator, under the intense, unfiltered sun of East Africa. That balance worked perfectly. Homo sapiens evolved there with dark, melanin-rich skin, hair, and eyes, a direct shield against some of the strongest ultraviolet radiation found anywhere on Earth, sunlight strong enough, day after day, generation after generation, to make that protection essential rather than optional. It wasn't just sufficient. It was ideal, precisely tuned to the environment that shaped it, a fit so exact it would take an enormous change in circumstances to ever disrupt it. So what happened when humans started walking away from it, generation after generation, further from the equator than their bodies had ever been designed to go? As early humans began migrating out of Africa, spreading gradually toward regions with dramatically less sunlight, walking further north each generation, into landscapes their bodies had never been shaped for, the very trait that had once protected them so effectively became something else entirely, a liability. Two major dispersal events mark this shift clearly. Homo erectus moved into Eurasia roughly 1.8 million years ago, and much later, Homo sapiens followed a similar path outward from Africa around 55,000 years ago. Both groups carried the same dark, sun-adapted skin into environments where sunlight simply wasn't as intense or as constant. Picture it. Skies grayer, days shorter, sunlight filtering weakly through clouds and long winters, nothing like the direct equatorial glare their bodies had evolved to withstand, whole seasons passing with barely enough UV reaching the skin to matter. Suddenly, that same protective melanin, once essential, was blocking far more UV light than these bodies actually needed to survive. The body couldn't simply choose a new skin color. So how does evolution solve a problem like that over thousands of generations? This is where the leading scientific explanation comes in, known as the vitamin D, folate hypothesis. It's important to frame this clearly. This is the leading theory among researchers, not an absolute, settled fact, and researchers themselves are careful to describe it that way. According to this model, dark skin does an excellent job protecting folate, a nutrient critical for healthy cell division and development, but in low UV environments, that same protection blocks too much sunlight to produce adequate vitamin D. Lighter skin flips that trade-off, letting in more UV to support vitamin D production, at some cost to folate protection. As natural selection favored continued vitamin D production in these lower UV regions, populations gradually lost some of their constitutive pigmentation, generation folding into generation, the change so slow no single lifetime could ever have noticed it happening. Vitamin D itself isn't a minor detail either. It plays a genuinely vital role in bone strength, immune function, and even reducing risk for certain cancers and heart disease, health consequences that stretch across an entire lifetime, meaning this trade-off carried real, lasting consequences for survival, not just for one generation, but for every generation that followed. For most of the 20th century, scientists thought they already knew the answer to why skin color varies at all, confident enough to teach it as settled fact in classrooms for generations. And they were wrong. For decades, a different, once popular theory dominated the conversation, the idea that melanin evolved primarily to prevent sunburn and skin cancer. It made intuitive sense on the surface, an easy story to tell, an easy one to believe, but modern research has directly challenged this explanation. Sunburn and skin cancer, it turns out, have negligible effects on reproductive success, meaning they occur too late in life, generally after reproductive years, to meaningfully shape natural selection. An idea that once seemed obvious simply doesn't hold up under closer scientific scrutiny. If it wasn't sunburn or cancer, something even stranger was happening at the genetic level, something that had nothing to do with disease at all, and remarkably, it happened more than once. Lighter skin didn't evolve just one single time in human history. Genetic research has verified at least 3 separate, independent occurrences of skin depigmentation evolving across entirely different hominin lineages, each one arising separately as different populations dispersed into their own low UV environments, thousands of kilometers apart, with no contact, no shared knowledge, no way of knowing another population was solving the exact same problem at the exact same time. Different genes, different populations, different points on the globe, and yet, evolution kept arriving at strikingly similar solutions, again and again, almost as if the same problem, presented with the same basic biological pressures, simply had a limited number of workable answers, and nature kept rediscovering them independently. Scientists increasingly describe human skin pigmentation not as fixed categories at all, but as existing along a continuous spectrum, a kind of sepia rainbow, shaped repeatedly by migration, local sunlight conditions, and the body's ongoing need for vitamin D. If evolution kept arriving at the same solution on its own, why does Europe's story turn out to be more complicated than sunlight alone? Here's a detail that genuinely surprises most people. To be clear, this next part applies specifically to Europe, not to human populations generally. Genetic evidence shows that lighter skin tones in Europe developed far more recently than most assume, as recently as around 5,000 years ago, a blink of an eye compared to the million-year timescales we've been talking about so far. And crucially, this shift wasn't driven primarily by gradual adaptation to local sunlight at all. It was driven substantially by migration, specifically, populations moving in from western Anatolia and the Russian steppe, carrying lighter pigmentation into the region and mixing with existing populations already living there. That means for thousands of years, early Europeans looked nothing like what most people picture today when they imagine ancient European ancestry, dark-skinned hunter-gatherers living across a landscape now associated almost entirely with pale skin. So what was actually driving this transformation? Was it sunlight? Migration? Or something far more layered than a single clean explanation? The honest answer researchers point to is complexity itself. Modern science increasingly treats skin color not as the product of one single clean cause, but as the outcome of several interacting pressures working together, layered on top of each other across thousands of generations, each factor pulling in its own direction, none of them acting entirely alone. Geographic UV exposure certainly matters. But so do specific pigmentation genes, diet-related genes affecting nutrient absorption, and even cultural practices, clothing, shelter, time spent outdoors, that shape how much sunlight a population's skin actually experiences day to day. Skin color, seen through this lens, isn't a simple equation with one variable. It's the layered result of genetics, geography, nutrition, and human movement, all interacting across thousands of generations, no single thread telling the whole story on its own, no simple formula anyone could reduce it to. All of this raises one final question, the same question hiding underneath everything we've covered so far. If skin color really is just the body's response to sunlight and geography, what does that actually say about the differences we see today? Bring it all together, and the full picture becomes remarkably clear. One shared origin in East Africa, where dark skin first evolved as protection against intense equatorial UV radiation, under a sun that gave early humans no other option. Repeated, independent adaptations as separate populations migrated into lower UV environments across the globe, arriving at the same answer without ever knowing it, without ever comparing notes, separated by oceans and continents in thousands of years. And later, entirely additional layers, like the migration-driven lightning seen in Europe roughly 5,000 years ago, reshaping the picture even further, proof that this story never really stopped unfolding, and likely never will. Every skin tone on Earth today is really just a different chapter of the same 5 million-year-old story, written by sunlight, migration, and the human body's constant effort to find balance wherever it happened to end up. Every difference we see today began with the same ancestors under the same African sun. We didn't become different kinds of people. We simply adapted to different worlds. Imagine trying to spend private, intimate time with your partner while your parents, children, grandparents, and siblings are all sleeping just a few feet away in the exact same room. No bedroom, no locked door, very little privacy. For most modern couples, that sounds like an uncomfortable, almost impossible situation. Yet for most of human history, this wasn't unusual, it was completely normal. Today, we view having a dedicated, private bedroom with a door that shuts as a basic right of home ownership or adult life. So how did millions of couples across centuries build families, maintain relationships, and find intimacy without the private bedrooms we take for granted today? When we look back at history, modern viewers often assume that personal privacy is a timeless human need, something that has always existed in the exact same way it does today. In reality, privacy itself has a long, surprising history. Archaeologists and historians studying prehistoric settlements, ancient cities, and medieval villages have discovered that privacy as we understand it simply was not built into the architecture. Houses were constructed for utility, warmth, and collective survival, not personal space. Ancient people didn't solve the challenge of intimacy with keys and locks, they solved it through surprisingly creative social adaptations. If physical space couldn't create privacy, what could? To understand how ancient couples lived, you first have to look closely at the structures they called home. Archaeological evidence from Roman Pompeii, medieval European peasant cottages, and ancient Near Eastern farming villages reveals a remarkably consistent pattern. Most ordinary families lived in tiny, 1- or 2-room houses. Multiple generations ate, cooked, worked, and slept together in a single shared area. Separate bedrooms were almost exclusively a luxury reserved for the wealthiest elite. These domestic spaces were designed around the practical demands of everyday life, family labor, cooking meals, storing harvest, defense against wild animals or raiders, and keeping warm. Romantic seclusion simply was not on the blueprints. In a medieval European cottage, livestock might even sleep under the same roof at night to keep the space warm and safe. In ancient Near Eastern houses, family members laid out sleeping mats next to each other on dirt or plaster floors. If an entire household slept in the exact same room night after night, when could couples possibly find time to be alone? Surprisingly, the solution wasn't bigger houses at all. It was time. Historians studying agricultural labor patterns and domestic life believe that privacy was frequently temporary rather than permanent. Instead of looking for a private room, ancient couples relied on timing. They learned to navigate the predictable rhythms of daily life to find brief, quiet moments together. Couples seized micro-moments within the day, windows of time when children were outside playing, older relatives were out fetching water or tending to crops, or neighbors were gathered at local market stalls. In agrarian societies, daily labor kept people outdoors for long stretches. The home wasn't a place where people stayed all day, it was primarily for shelter at night. Daily schedules and seasonal routines dictated intimacy far more than house plans ever did. But timing only solved part of the problem. What happened when the weather turned harsh, or when someone actually had the wealth to change the physical house itself? For those with wealth and status, privacy was crafted using furniture and textiles rather than permanent brick-and-mortar walls. Historical evidence from the Roman Empire shows that wealthier households often used rich bed curtains to create a measure of privacy within larger rooms. In ancient China, during the Han and Tang dynasties, prosperous family compounds relied on elaborate folding screens, decorative alcoves, and partitioned spaces to visually separate living quarters. By the Middle Ages and early Renaissance, elite European homes featured heavy, fully enclosed wooden box beds, essentially small wooden rooms built inside a larger room, fitted with doors or heavy drapes. Archaeological evidence, surviving furniture, and ancient frescoes show that these physical barriers were quite effective at blocking sight. However, as contemporary manuscripts and legal records remind us, fabric curtains and wooden panels blocked vision, not sound. Even for the wealthy, someone, whether a relative, a roommate, or a domestic worker, was usually still nearby. So where did couples go when the house itself wasn't enough? When four walls offered no guarantee of solitude, the open sky became the substitute. Nature often became the only truly private room available. Historians and literary scholars point to a massive body of ancient literature that describes lovers meeting far away from crowded domestic spaces. From Greek pastoral poetry and the famous Roman verses of Ovid and Virgil, to the ancient Hebrew imagery found in the Song of Songs and classical Chinese love poetry, romantic encounters are repeatedly set outdoors. Lovers meet in fields, orchards, vineyards, riverbanks, and secluded forests. The rural landscape provided the physical distance and quiet that small, crowded homes lacked. Stepping outside the village boundary offered a level of sanctuary that domestic architecture could never match. But what happened if you weren't an ordinary farmer or villager slipping away into an orchard? What if you were royalty, living in the grandest palace in the land? You might assume that kings, queens, and nobility enjoyed absolute privacy inside their sprawling palaces, but historical evidence tells a completely different story. While royal compounds contained massive private apartments, monarchs were almost never actually alone. Palaces were bustling public spaces filled with court officials, guards, political advisors, servants, and ladies-in-waiting. From morning dressing rituals to evening routines, ceremonial royal life required a constant human presence. Attendants slept on folding cots or floor cushions in the outer chambers or even at the foot of the royal bed to respond to any nighttime request or security threat. Even within the most luxurious palaces, complete spatial privacy was virtually non-existent. If even the richest and most powerful people in the world struggled to find spatial isolation, perhaps privacy wasn't really about wealth at all. Ultimately, historians believe that privacy in the ancient world was maintained through an unwritten, deeply respected social agreement. Communities and extended families understood that married couples required time together, even if physical space was tight. Tactful ignorance, customary routines, household etiquette, and staggered work schedules created a silent understanding among housemates. If everyone in a single-room home pretended not to notice what was happening behind a thin curtain or in a dark corner, a functional form of privacy was created through mutual consent. Privacy wasn't a physical room you walked into, it was a subtle boundary that your household mutually agreed to honor. So if societies accepted communal living for thousands of years, why do we expect so much physical separation today? It was only between the 17th and 19th centuries that domestic architecture in Europe began to shift dramatically. As economic conditions changed, the concept of the single-family home with specialized rooms, hallway-accessed bedrooms, dedicated dining spaces, and private quarters became a common standard. Modern architectural design began to prioritize the individual over the collective family unit. Millions of couples throughout history built families, raised children, and maintained deep, meaningful relationships without ever owning a private sanctuary with a locked door. They didn't wait for the perfect room, they adapted to the shared lives they had. For most of history, privacy wasn't something people owned. It was something they borrowed, from timing, trust, custom, and the spaces around them. Modern bedrooms didn't invent intimacy. They simply made it easier. Imagine scraping your teeth clean with a stick, crushed shells, or even burnt bones. No toothpaste, no toothbrush, no mint, just whatever nature happened to leave within reach. Yet people kept their teeth clean this way for thousands of years. So what actually worked? The answer isn't one invention. It's dozens of clever solutions, created independently by different civilizations, thousands of miles apart, each one using whatever nature placed around them, whatever grew in their soil, whatever washed up on their coastline, whatever their own culture had already learned to trust. Modern toothpaste, the kind sitting in your bathroom right now, is surprisingly recent when you place it against the full span of human history. But dental hygiene itself is ancient, stretching back long before written language, long before anyone could record exactly when it began. Long before supermarkets, before pharmacies, before a single dentist's office existed, people were already cleaning their teeth using plants, minerals, and handmade tools, working with instinct and trial and error rather than any formula. Some trusted trees, stripping bark and fiber for something rough enough to scrub against enamel. Others trusted crushed stone, grinding it down into a fine, gritty powder. And one civilization, as we'll see, may have quietly invented the ancestor of the very toothbrush still sitting in your bathroom cup today, centuries before anyone in the Western world thought to attach bristles to a handle. The earliest solution wasn't a brush at all. It was a stick. Across many ancient cultures, people used what historians now call chewing sticks, twigs cut from specific trees, frayed carefully at one end until the fibers separated into something close to natural bristles, then rubbed directly against the teeth and gums. This wasn't random. Different cultures gravitated toward different plants, and remarkably, many of these plants happened to contain natural antibacterial compounds, whether or not anyone at the time understood the chemistry behind why they worked so well. The best documented example by far is the meswak, taken from the Salvadora persica tree. Archaeological finds, ancient Egyptian records, and centuries of Islamic historical texts all reference its use, and it hasn't disappeared into history the way so many ancient tools have. Modern dental research has actually studied the meswak directly, confirming what generations of use had already suggested, that it carries genuine antibacterial properties. It remains in active use today, in some regions, sitting right alongside modern toothpaste rather than being replaced by it entirely. But a stick could only do so much. What happened when civilizations wanted something stronger, something that could actually clean rather than simply scrub? In ancient Egypt, people didn't just brush. They mixed. Medical papyri from ancient Egypt describe powdered preparations for cleaning teeth, and modern researchers have reconstructed one recipe using ingredients such as rock salt, dried iris flower, mint, and pepper. This represents one reconstructed formula, not necessarily the only toothpaste Egyptians used. It's worth being precise about what this actually was. This wasn't a paste in the modern sense, nothing smooth, nothing squeezed from a tube. It functioned as an abrasive cleaning powder, something applied and worked against the teeth to physically scrape away buildup, closer in spirit to a scouring agent than to the minty gel most of us squeeze onto a toothbrush today. Still, think about what that recipe actually represents. Someone, thousands of years ago, was deliberately combining ingredients, adjusting a formula, refining a mixture specifically for oral hygiene. This wasn't an accident stumbled into once. It was documented, deliberate, medical knowledge, passed down and preserved well enough that we can still read the recipe today. If powders worked so well for the Egyptians, why did later civilizations start grinding even stranger ingredients into their own versions? The Greeks and Romans took this idea and pushed it somewhere considerably more abrasive. Writers like Pliny the Elder documented tooth powders made from an unusual combination of materials: charcoal, crushed bones, oyster shells, pumice, and various herbs, ground down and mixed for daily use. Picture it for a moment, someone in ancient Rome working a rough, gritty powder made partly from crushed shell and volcanic stone directly against their teeth, polishing enamel the same way you might polish a stone surface. These powders weren't gentle, but they served a genuine purpose, helping to physically remove debris and polish the surface of the teeth, a rough but functional solution shaped entirely by whatever raw materials happened to be close at hand, from quarries, kitchens, and the shoreline alike. But while Europe was busy experimenting with increasingly abrasive powders, another civilization on the other side of the world was quietly reinventing the tool itself. China took a completely different path. Instead of endlessly refining the powder, Chinese innovation focused on the brush. Herbal tooth powders were already common practice, much like elsewhere in the ancient world. But during the Song dynasty, something genuinely new appeared, a tool combining hog bristles attached firmly to a handle carved from bamboo or bone. This wasn't just another powder recipe or another twig pulled from a tree. It was a purpose-built instrument, engineered specifically for brushing, and historians widely consider it one of the earliest true ancestors of the modern toothbrush, centuries before anything resembling it would appear in Europe. But not everyone owned a specialized bristled tool like this. Bamboo handles and hog bristles weren't universally available, and manufacturing them took skill and resources many ordinary households simply didn't have. So how did everyday people, far from Song dynasty workshops, actually keep their teeth clean? In medieval Europe, most people relied on considerably simpler household items. Linen cloth, rubbed directly across the teeth, served as an improvised brush. Salt, sage, charcoal, and various herbs remained common cleaning materials, most of them already sitting in a kitchen or garden rather than purchased specially for dental care. Toothpicks, too, were widely used, a small but genuinely important tool for clearing debris caught between teeth after a meal. None of this required specialized manufacturing or rare imported ingredients. It was resourceful, practical, built entirely from what an ordinary household already had within reach. Yet here's perhaps the biggest surprise hiding inside this entire story. Having no toothpaste didn't always mean having bad teeth. Many people naturally assume ancient teeth must have been in terrible condition, simply because toothpaste as we know it didn't exist yet. But the archaeological evidence tells a far more surprising, far more complicated story. Studies of ancient skulls, particularly among hunter-gatherer populations, often reveal heavily worn teeth, ground down by coarse, fibrous, unprocessed food, but relatively few cavities compared to what you might expect. The wear was real. The decay, strikingly, often wasn't. That pattern shifted dramatically once agriculture spread. As diets increasingly centered around grains and other carbohydrate-rich foods, cavities became noticeably more common across skeletal remains from this period onward, and centuries later, when refined sugar entered the picture at scale, tooth decay rose dramatically once again. A clear, measurable pattern bioarchaeologists can trace directly through the teeth themselves, layer by layer, population by population. Toothpaste, as it eventually developed, absolutely helped improve oral hygiene over time. But diet, it turns out, was often just as important, and in some periods, arguably even more important, than whatever people were actually cleaning their teeth with. If ancient people could sometimes have healthier teeth without any toothpaste at all, simply because of what they were eating, what does that actually say about how we think about our own dental care today? There was never one single ancient toothpaste, no universal formula passed down unchanged across the world. Every civilization cleaned its teeth differently, using whatever plants, minerals, and tools happened to be available within its own environment, shaped by geography, climate, culture, and daily life. Some trusted chewing sticks, pulled straight from a tree with proven antibacterial properties. Some mixed carefully measured abrasive powders, refined and documented well enough to survive on papyrus for thousands of years. Some invented early toothbrushes entirely, engineering bristles and handles centuries ahead of the rest of the world. And every single one of them, regardless of continent or century, was trying to solve the exact same everyday problem, long before the toothpaste tube ever existed. The tube of toothpaste on your sink isn't the beginning of this story. It's simply the newest chapter. For thousands of years, people cared for their teeth using the plants, minerals, and tools around them. What changed over time wasn't just what they brushed with, it was also what they ate. Long before mint-flavored toothpaste, the desire for a healthy smile was already part of being human.